Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Javier Espinoza, Europe Executive Editor at the Capital Forum. Greetings from Brussels towards the end of a wild year, some might say. We'll take the next sort of 45 minutes or so to have a conversation with someone that I've been having lots of conversations over the years, Jorge Padilla, chair of Compass Lexecon, an authority on competition economics, someone who is well embedded in the field, the practice, who's done cases for and against big tech and other companies, married to an enforcer, affiliated with the Toulouse School of Economics, and who's been interacted with regulators and in many different positions and perspectives and cases throughout your career. Thank you, Jorge, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
And apologies for the slight delay in the start of our conversation today. We had some technical issues, but I hope it's worth your while. And I basically wanted to start talking to you about, since we are towards the end of 2025, just a little bit of reflection and your perspective as to how you see the geopolitical dynamics affecting the world of antitrust today.
So I think that first, the geopolitics has been, quite interesting and bumpy over the year, starting from early in January with the change in administration in the U.S., then Liberation Day around April, the various trade wars or trade disputes. The confrontation between China and the U.S., what is happening in Europe with the war in Ukraine, and so on. Lots of movement, lots of changes, lots of things that, to some extent, we have not seen. I'm not going to dare to say never before, because history is very long and lots of things have happened over the centuries. But I don't think that we have lived or seen in our lifetimes. And of course, all that geopolitical movement and all those geopolitical changes have had an impact on the world of antitrust. When I started the year in 2025, I thought that this was going to be a year of lots of merger activity, that there would be lots of transactions, that things in business would be relatively stable. That was not the case, especially since Liberation Day, but even a little bit before, when all that was anticipated. The increase in uncertainty was so dramatic that you could see how business people were reacting to that uncertainty, freezing out a number of potential transactions. And as a result of that, the level of merger activity in Europe and the US and elsewhere declined quite significantly, which had an impact on everybody that lives in the antitrust community, whether they are regulators or lawyers or competition economists. And then, 2025 has also been the year of the DMA in Europe. And again, that has had quite a bit of an impact, both on the internal dynamics of the competition law and economics community, with shifting focus from perhaps more traditional antitrust enforcement to ex-ante regulation, but also has had very significant geopolitical implications, because you can see how a competition instrument or a regulatory instrument has been now, or is being interpreted on the other side of the Atlantic, as a behind the border trade barrier, and how that is triggering, potential responses, that are more typical of a trade war than the sort of interactions that we were used to observe in the antitrust community, with, as you're aware, hearings in the U.S. Judiciary Committee in Congress a couple of days ago, talking about the geopolitical implications of the DMA and so on. So a very interesting year in the bad sense of the word interesting, with lots of uncertainty and leading us, in a position for 2026, which is also quite uncertain, although I think that there are a number of things that are becoming clear and at this point in time. Lots of action, lots to learn.
Lots of action and lots to learn. I, for one, have had more of an interest in reading about trade and how it's interacting, and we have been producing stories on the interaction between digital and trade policy. Can we lots to flesh out on this sort of summary of the year? You said it's the year of the DMA. I would argue also is the year of the Digital Services Act, the sister law.
Correct.
Of the DMA, and one that had been spoken about a lot in various speeches by the Vice President as well of the US. And so can we talk about, before we get into the trade and how that might look like next year, talk about from traditional to ex ante, and then we saw at the beginning, just like a few days ago, back to traditional, because the Commission also opened a classic antitrust investigation into Google AI, another one into Meta. So can we do a bit of a diagnosis of where we are on the DMA enforcement in particular?
Yeah, look, I think that my reading, and I'm emphasizing my reading because I think that there are many different opinions, and as we are, experiencing this as we go along, it may take time before somebody is able to write the history of what is happening with a level of objectivity that I certainly don't have. I think that my reading is that the DMA came about in order to address a number of pitfalls identified with the enforcement of antitrust laws in digital markets. That enforcement was slow, but more importantly, that it was slow, that it was complex, but more importantly, that it was not achieving, or it was not capable of addressing the problems, so the competition problems that existed in a way that was satisfactory. So it was slow because it's, the process guarantees, due process, et cetera, et cetera. Some people say that it was slow also because we economists complicate things. It was complex because you need to define markets in fast-moving industries, et cetera, et cetera. But more importantly, at the end of the day, all these one or two cases ended up in some form of cease and desist. And that, in a sense, was seen as ineffective because by the time that the cease and desist was implemented, the market had moved, and the one or two cases were not able to restore conditions of competition. And I think that the DMA comes to bring that whole. But in my opinion, what it did at the same time, and I think that it may be an unintended consequence of the DMA, is that it moves us away from ex post enforcement into ex ante regulation. And I say inadvertently because I think that everybody thought that ex ante was going to be much easier, because this was a particularly unique form of ex ante. This was ex ante with collaboration. Ex ante, but ex ante.
That had been the conversations with many officials throughout the tracking of the DMA.
Right, because in a sense, this was an ex ante regulation that was meant to do what I think that many of us thought that we needed, which was some form of market investigation regime, which is a kind of ex ante ex post. That was not possible, so we ended up with ex ante regulation, but an ex ante regulation in which there is no ex ante price regulation, and where we want the regulated to help the regulator to self-regulate, in a sense. And I think that that process that was anticipated as a highly collaborative exercise has ended up being much more controversial and adversarial than many people thought. And to some extent, with the benefit of hindsight, not surprisingly, because, in a sense, they are diverging views. The views of the regulator, the views of the regulated, and the views of all these other companies that want the regulated companies to be regulated in particular ways. And so the DMA, in a sense, has not solved much the issue of complexity. Maybe has reduced economic complexity, but there is complexity. There is litigation. There is an adversarial context, and it hasn't addressed the problems that we thought it would address, and has created new problems. An ex-ante regulation is a legislative act, as opposed to an enforcement of law, and law that was established in tempore non suspecto. So laws that were established way before digital firms reach the positions in the markets where they operate that they currently enjoy. And so, in a sense, from the other side of the Atlantic, they are seeing, and this is my interpretation again, they are seeing the DMA as a much more hostile action than the enforcement of antitrust, than the enforcement of laws that are not tailored to a particular type of sector or a particular type of company. So the DMA has not solved, in my opinion, the problems that it was asked to solve, and has generated these political, geopolitical, trade tensions. And so I'm not entirely surprised that we are seeing some form of move backwards towards more traditional enforcement, the sort of enforcement that is more commonplace on both sides of the Atlantic, a sort of enforcement that you cannot call European, that you have to acknowledge that it follows standard practice also in the US.
In the US, I mean, the EU would say, and proponents of the DMA would also argue, as you said at the beginning, that it's still early days. The ambition of the DMA and what it's trying to do, as explained to me by officials here, is to put a straitjacket on these companies that have become too powerful and too dominant, to allow or enable ecosystems to grow. And I guess that you can't do that in a space of literally just 2-3 years.
Certainly. Unfortunately, we live in an accelerated world, and in this accelerated world, the DMA has to coexist with the race that exists between the US and China for technological dominance. And in that context, the DMA is interpreted outside Europe, and in particular in the US, as a dimension, as a policy adopted by a third party that impairs their chances to succeed in the race with China. I think that, if I may, Javier, I think that the DMA, or the positions of the US and China with respect to the DMA, sorry, US and Europe with respect to the DMA, are misinterpreted on both sides of the Atlantic. I think that the US see incorrectly, in my opinion, the DMA as an anti-American piece of legislation. I don't think that there is anything anti-American on it in terms of its conception. Another thing is what happens de facto, because most of the companies are US, most of the regulated companies are US, but I don't think that it's anti-American in purpose. But at the same time, from Europe, we believe that it's enough for us to say that it's not anti-American to, in a sense, appease the US. And the US, in my opinion, sees this as saying, okay, it may not be anti-American in purpose, in objective, in goal, but de facto is regulating a number of companies that are American, who are competing in a global race against the Chinese. The Chinese are not affected to the same extent. So you Europeans may not be evil, but you are, in a sense, playing the role of useful idiots in this technological race between the US and China. And I think that that's why I believe that the US and Europe, as regards to DMA, are a little bit like ships crossing in the night without understanding each other.
Mm-hmm. That many wars have happened in history as a result of misunderstandings. There have been some concrete, though, changes that have come about directly as a result of the DMA. For instance, Apple updating its payment options or offering, or allowing users to uninstall default apps, or Google making changes on search engine screens. Meta, only a few weeks or days ago, making changes to this pay or consent social media ads online, so that we are already seeing glimmers of specific, concrete, verifiable effects on consumers.
That's correct, and I think that many of these results that we are observing are the ones that, in a sense, were intended to be obtained in cases that happened in the past, and one or two cases, abuse of dominance cases that happened in the past, where the remedies, did not achieve the results that we are starting to see. And some of these initiatives are not that different from what the U.S. government itself is trying to achieve in the U.S. in the various litigations that it has opened. And personally, I think that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with the DMA. And as I mentioned at the outset, it's early days to judge whether it's going to achieve positive outcome for consumer. What it's not achieving in the short term is the very, quick and fast deployment and results that I think that many expected. I'm not surprised about the delay, and I hope that we have time to see what results are obtained, because they can provide guidance in other jurisdictions, including the US. But I'm concerned that in these geopolitical times, we may not have the luxury of time.
We've seen the dynamics between the US and the EU so far. The DMA caught in the crossfire of these two blocks, let's say, or powers. How do you see 2026 as we head into the new year? You think we've seen the worst of the escalation of these tensions?
No, I don't think so. I think that because I think that the dynamics between Europe and the US is derived from the dynamics between the US and China, and the race, the AI race, the quantum computing race, all these technological races, I think that are going to be on for a number of years, and therefore I think that for as long as that goes, everything is going to be judged. Everything from the US and from China is going to be judged from that lens. And so the question on both sides is always going to be: is Europe helpful to us or not? Because let's face it, we are not one of the main actors in this bipolar world. We are not a third pole. This is not a multipolar world, as some people say. For the time being, as of 2020, at the end of 2025 and beginning of 2026, this is a bipolar world. And then, you can try to be part of the middle, but the middle is always judged and assessed on the basis of whether it favors one side or the other.
How does Europe get to be a real third force that you're describing today? It's not. What needs to happen?
Well, it needs to become Europe, or it needs to become the United States of Europe. It needs to, at very least on the economic front, it needs to achieve the single market. I think that there is a wide consensus on that. We don't have a single market for services. We barely have an effective single market for goods. We really don't have as much labor mobility as we should. And personally, because I am, more of a federalist, I think that economic integration is not enough. Eventually, you need to have a common defense policy. And I don't see how you can have really a common defense policy that you can fully trust unless you make efforts to unify politically. Europe needs to grow. Europe needs to be powerful. If we are, I don't know exactly what is the figure now, whether we are 12, 13, or 15% of global GDP, that still makes us count, but not as much as we counted when we were, a much greater share or enjoyed a much greater share of global GDP. We want to have voice, we need to have muscle. To have muscle, we need to stop being and acting like little pawns and little fish, and we need to accept that we need to sacrifice some of our national sovereignty in order to be able to grow. Not to confront others, but to have voice. At the moment, we don't have voice, and when you don't have voice and you cannot exit, you are in a very weak position, and that's where we are.
And in a way, you're echoing what Draghi and Letta, the calls that they have been making of having a more cohesive single market, maybe even more consolidation in some sectors like telecoms. Where do you see if we now move to, you said that at the beginning we had the situation of frozen transactions. I think I can track maybe one or two big things that happened, but that in relative terms were not of the scale or the complexity that we saw before. And as we move into 2026, we have a blockbuster deal, potentially two blockbuster deals that the Commission may be examining and other regulators around the world. Where do you see, first of all, the deal activity and then also the policy that goes next to it in this idea of the Draghi report and calls from, a more consolidated single market? I think these are kind of related.
Yeah, my sense is that what you see in terms of mergers these days are two types of mergers. And I think that this is something that I expected to see from the beginning of the year, but it's happening more in Q4. And so it's going to take us to 2026. There are two types of mergers. Mergers that come from the other side of the Atlantic that have a repercussion here. Mergers that have a US logic and have an impact on our markets, because many of our markets are served by those US companies, and that have a logic. And then within Europe, I think that you're going to see lots of transactions, which I would call restructuring transactions. Transactions that are going to happen in industries that are in decline, or transactions in industries where, in order to survive in the new world, massive reorganizations are needed. And these are very different, and in my opinion, they should be, of course, at some point assessing the same way with the same principles, but politically have very different implications, and maybe we want to, or the regulators want to factor in those issues. So if we talk about the transactions that originate in the US, look, in the US, mergers as an exit mechanism work quite efficiently. Companies that are having difficulties are acquired by others. Companies that are struggling are acquired by others. And that, from the European perspective, is fine, but the thing that we care is about our consumers. And in a sense, for us, what matters is what the price effects and the quality effects and the innovation effects are. I don't see any other dimension. Those transactions, in my opinion, are plain vanilla in that respect. Now, when we think about European transactions happening within Europe and restructuring, I think that first approach is identical, but there is a second dimension. And the second dimension is that we need to recognize that Europe is full of zombie firms. It's full of firms that are there, that are survive, that barely survive but don't invest. And they are kept alive either with support from taxpayers' money, directly or indirectly through banks. Banks that don't want to recognize the problems that those companies have, and they keep refinancing them, and they need to exit. Exit takes ages in this continent, and some of that exit could happen through mergers, but those mergers may be, on the basis of traditional analysis, questioned because these are concentrated industries. The reason why they are concentrated is because demand has been declining, and when demand has been declining, there has been some exit, insufficient, but some exit. There, I think that is where we need to perhaps reconsider the way that we deal with failing firms, flailing firms, where we allow the reconstruction or the restructuring of European markets. They're going to be in many sectors. Telecoms is one of the sectors, but there are many other sectors which have been negatively impacted over the last few years as a result of the digital disruption and other disruptions, and they need restructuring. And the question is whether we allow mergers to be one way to restructure or we don't. And if we don't, what else we are going to do? And I think that the idea of keep throwing bad money after good and keep throwing money to industries that have no future, which is something that we have been doing in various member states over the years, is a bad idea. So if it's not mergers, I think the European politicians should come with alternatives, and alternatives that allow those industries to restructure.
And we're going to have to think about these alternatives, because in my various conversations with the key people, leading efforts in the Commission on mergers and these policies, I have said it before, it's a bit of a dogma that in some sectors, like the telecom sectors, there cannot be, it's impossible. It's like, not conceivable to many people inside the Commission that there can be a 4-3 consolidation, for example, in telcos. And the fear, which is real and in the minds of the regulators, is that of high prices, fewer choices for consumers, less innovation. So I don't think that's going to change next year.
Right. I don't doubt that if you have consolidation, the first impact is an increase in prices. And there is, of course, if there is consolidation, there may be a restriction of choice. What is not that clear to me is whether there is going to be a reduction of innovation and investment. And in particular, whether that can be addressed through investment remedies. And I should disclose conflict here. I worked for Vodafone and Three in the UK transaction, and we argued that investment was going to go up, and the authority didn't quite believe that we were going to have the incentives, and we offered investment commitments. My view is that the UK experiment is going to be central to whatever is going to happen in the telecom sector in Europe.
And just to give the full context for people that may not be familiar with the deal, this is one that the CMA actually cleared on this innovation investment promise, right?
Right. So it was a 4-3 transaction, or at least that is the way that it was characterized by the agency. And it was approved subject to two types of remedies. The main remedy were investment commitments, 11 billion pounds in a period of time of 5 years, or 6 years, I don't remember in all detail, and some behavioral commitments in terms of prices in the transition period. And when I say that it is crucial is, suppose that it works, assume that it works, and it appears that it's working. Why that template cannot be used elsewhere? If indeed it leads to greater investment, to greater quality, and makes consumers better off, because when you take into account the effect on prices adjusting for quality, they end up better off. And those customers that are vulnerable are nonetheless protected by these interim price remedies. If that works, it's going to be very hard, in my opinion, for any regulator around Europe to stick to the view that you cannot have a 4-3 that leads to greater investment, and that the way to ensure that that is indeed the case is through investment remedies. If it doesn't work, then I think that the position of those that are, and I understand them, I understand the reasons, skeptical may be vindicated. But if the UK experiment works, then I think that I would expect that they would update their beliefs and adjust them to the new evidence.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Just a reminder to our listeners, please do send your questions through the chat box on your screens on the right-hand side at the bottom. Let's now talk about, I can't believe we've gone through this conversation without mentioning the two letters, AI, when it comes to enforcement. And I know that you've yourself looked at this in detail. How is the AI evolution influencing the way that enforcers are looking at market power dynamics?
So I think that lots of emphasis has been placed thus far in when talking about antitrust and AI on the potential use by companies of AI tools to facilitate collusion. And frankly, I don't have much to add to that debate. I can see the problem, and I can see the concern, and I can see why the agencies are concerned about that and are thinking of how to adapt their tools. But I think that AI in the world of antitrust brings additional dimensions which are important. My main concern with the way that we conduct competition cases, not only in Europe, elsewhere as well, is that sometimes we run these cases with placing excessive emphasis on documentary evidence and insufficient emphasis on evidence, on factual evidence, on economic evidence. And I think AI tools can help us to bring evidence, to use evidence, and to use evidence in a more objective way. I think that AI tools can facilitate the job of the agencies when requesting information. Forensic tools will be developed and will facilitate the production of data, and therefore I would suppose that as a result of that, the agencies are going to be able to obtain more, better, and faster data. But also AI tools can also debias the way that that information is being processed, the way that it is prepared, the way that it is analyzed by the parties and their consultants, and the way that the agencies analyze that evidence. Because thus far, as I said, I think that these cases are run with limited evidence, and very often the same facts are interpreted in a very biased way, or that evidence is being supported or discarded in ways that do not reflect objective assessments, but they are more motivated. And I want to make sure that I clarify that the motivations oftentimes come from both sides of the equation and not just one side.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk, and we have a question now from the chat about algorithmic data consolidation in big tech is one question. No more details about it, but I guess it's, I would imagine, is to do with how enforcers are dealing with this subject.
So look, I think that like any other new technology, it has associated to it a value chain, a vertical value chain, from compute, data, energy, and so on. And what we want is development of models, implementation, marketing, etc. And I think that what we need to make sure is that nobody monopolizes the capabilities required to be active in any of the layers of that vertical chain. Now, what is the optimal number of players in each of the layers? I really don't know. I don't think that there is any theory that says 4 is a magic number, or 3 is a magic number, or 2 is a magic number. I think that 1 is always somewhat problematic in the absence of potential competition. So what we need to make sure is that there is, at very least, potential competition. And for that, what we need to make sure is that access to the relevant assets is not monopolized. And one of the assets is data. And data is necessary in order to train. Another asset is chipsets. Another asset is compute, hardware. Another asset will be, in the value chain, will be, all the engineering skill to develop the relevant software. Some layers are easier to monopolize than others because the assets are, more indispensable, more difficult to reproduce. And that's what we need to be. We need to be alert. I think that my opinion, personally, is early days. I don't see a concern yet, but I can see why we want to keep our eyes open in order to avoid that anyone monopolizes not just a layer, not that it has a high market share in a particular layer, it's that it monopolizes the assets and capabilities and skills that are necessary to penetrate and enter that layer.
How do we do that?
Well, again, we have merger control. And fundamentally, we have merger control, but we can also see whether a layer is monopolized, or the assets that would facilitate competition in that layer are monopolized through strategic behavior. So we have 102, we have 101, and we have merger control. And I don't think that at this stage we need anything else. I am typically fond of the UK market investigation tool. I wouldn't mind having that. But definitely what I don't think that we can do at this stage is to think about any form of ex-ante regulation in the AI realm. That's my personal opinion.
You're talking about ex-ante AI data collection specifically, or more broadly?
More broadly, I think that with the instruments, the ex-post enforcement instruments and the merger control, we have enough tools to make sure that nobody monopolizes the assets required to enter in each of the vertical layers of that vertical chain. I don't care whether somebody at one point in time has 80% market share or 75% market share. That's not the issue. The issue is whether that 75% or 80% is contestable. And the issue, therefore, is one of control over the assets that would facilitate a challenger to come and potentially leapfrog the incumbent.
Interesting. We have another question. How would the UK experiment you mentioned show that it worked? Lower prices, more investment, better service?
More investment, more investment, more investment, and then consumers acknowledging that they are getting the price quality deal is being good for them, that additional investment has translated in better service, better quality, and therefore they're happy to pay what is required to obtain that better service and quality.
Okay. I have another question here on the same topic. Do you think Vodafone 3 type remedies can or should be acceptable, workable, where there's no sector regulator? For example, Ofcom. It's the question.
I think that the absence of a sector regulator makes them a little bit more complicated, but is not a necessary condition. I think they may be sufficient, but not necessary. And let me explain why. What you require for those remedies to work is the ability to monitor the implementation of the remedy, and then you require the ability to sanction the lack of implementation. Monitoring, well, I think that there are a number of competition agencies within Europe that have monitoring units. I may be wrong, but my understanding is that that's not the case in Brussels. But there are member states that have monitoring units. These are additional resources, but I don't think that they are more expensive than getting it wrong. I think that the cost is worthwhile, monitoring and detecting impediments. In the case of Vodafone 3, the roadmap of investment was very clear on a month-by-month basis, almost a square kilometer by square kilometer. That can be monitored if you have the resources for monitoring, and I don't think that those are impossible. And then you need sanctions. And sanctions mean that the companies that make those commitments need to pledge something, and they need to pledge a crown jewel. In the case of Vodafone 3, they pledge their spectrum licenses. I don't see why that pledge cannot be made elsewhere in the telecom sector, where on top of that you have regulators, or you cannot pledge that even in sectors that are not regulated. You can always pledge a crown jewel. The question is whether the agency that monitors and detects that there is an infringement in the implementation of the remedy is going to have the guts to exercise the crown jewel. But I think that that's a problem for the agency. And I think that what the agencies need to do is empower themselves with monitoring tools, and they need to have the guts to exercise or sanction and demand the crown jewels that were pledged. And otherwise, they're restricting themselves to be in a third best or a fourth best by having to demand inadequate remedies or prohibit transactions that could be approved with the appropriate remedies if they had the proper capabilities.
Interesting. You talked about areas where we should be concerned about nascent monopolies, so just to watch, and we have to see. You talk about data, hardware, engineers. Are there any sort of traditional, I know you've written a lot about tying, for example, are there any other sort of areas of or bad behavior by monopolies or potential issues like the one that you outline in the data hardware value chain that we should be paying attention to?
If we fail to ensure that one of the layers, one or several of these layers in the vertical chain of AI is contestable, if we fail there, then we need to start worrying about leveraging from one layer to another, okay? But I don't think that we need to start worrying about that until or unless we think that we are not going to be able to prevent the monopolization and the lack and prevent the lack of contestability of a particular layer. So my recommendation to the agencies now is make sure that compute remains contestable. Doesn't need 4 people. It doesn't need 5 people. It's not a question of number. Remains contestable. Let's ensure that chipset availability remains contestable, and so on and so forth. And if we fail, because despite all efforts, the layer in question ends up featuring some elements of natural monopoly, then we need to worry about potential leveraging.
We started this conversation talking about the geopolitics and this bipolar world and a year of DMA and the challenges of this sort of 2 blocks, 2 powers not talking to each other. What 2026? What's in your mind the big picture, the big trend, the big narrative that we need to pay attention to? Maybe a false narrative, or maybe a distorted narrative, but where should we focus?
Frankly, I think that, or I would hope that the member states in the European Union focus on themselves, look internally, and look at the problems that we have internally. Unfortunately, we are conditioned by the war in Ukraine. That's perhaps our main external concern. I frankly think that the trade wars from the US are second order in terms of importance. I would even say that perhaps our best response is just to move on and ignore them to a large extent. I think that we need to focus on our internal problems. And our internal problems are lack of growth in productivity, aging populations, not being able to absorb immigration effectively and efficiently. We need to strengthen ourselves. 2026, if we spend strengthening ourselves, would make it for a better 2027 and 2028 for Europe. I would like our politicians to spend time thinking about how we complete the single market. How do we strengthen our links with the UK? How do we make this Europe of us stronger, as opposed to trying to play a role in global affairs? I think that Europe has to have a global presence, but it can only be global and successfully global if it's strong. And I think that we have spent too much time thinking about how these guys or those other guys think and how our regulations are going to impact the well-being of the world. I think that we need to think about strengthening ourselves. I believe that our principles are solid, but I think that we can only, transmit them to the rest of the world if we are strong. If we don't have voice, all that is left for us is exit.
One very unrelated question. It says, as a soccer fan, what does Jorge think of the ongoing news debate around the World Cup ticketing?
Well, I don't know about I'm a football fan, I'm an Atletico supporter, but I don't know what is happening with the football ticketing. If it's about prices being very high,
yeah.
Well, I believe that whoever is trying to do that is trying to maximize profit. So I think that they would have taken into account the elasticity of demand. And so, I have nothing to object.
A very economist answer to a football question. On that note, we've run out of time. Thank you to the listeners. Thank you to Jorge for your time. and have a good rest of the year and the best for 2026.
Happy holidays and the best of 2026 for all of you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.